Greetings. Welcome to the Religious Studies Project. My name is Brianne Fallon, and he's
Dave McConeghy. And it's so nice to speak to you again, Bri. We won't pretend with our listeners that I'm speaking to you while you're in Jerusalem, but I'm guessing that halfway through, or even more than halfway through your trip in Jerusalem, in the future Bri is doing really quite well.
Yeah, I'm sure future Bri is having a really good time. And in 2 days, future Bri will be going to Tel Aviv, which future Bri is very excited about.
It's really excellent. Speaking
of excellent, this week we have an excellent podcast by the wonderful Dave McConeghy. And
that's
you interviewed Bradley Onishi on the sacrality of the secular and philosophy of religion. And there really is nothing left to say, then take it away.
Welcome. My name is David McConeghy, and today I'm joined by Dr. Bradley Onishi, Associate Professor of Religion at Skidmore College in New York. He's also the co-author of Christian Mysticism, an Introduction to Contemporary Theoretical Approaches, the author of The Sacrality of the Secular, a major work about the philosophy of religion, and he co-hosts with Dan Miller the great podcast Straight White American Jesus. Thanks for being here with us today, Brad.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start right in on your most recent book, The Sacrality of the Secular, because I was so taken by the force of the analysis of the philosophy of religion and its relationship to religious studies. You start, as I think a lot of us do, with Max Weber and Sciences of Vocation for how we think about the secularization thesis, that idea that greater rationalism will end religion's appeal. That is a really persistent idea. We might call it a meme or viral today. We just can't seem to shake rationalism as the source of somehow disenchanted modern world. Mm. Can you speak about how you think about secularity and the secular that rejects that kind of narrative of rationalism and disenchantment? Because I think your book really starts with that powerful move right at the opening. So how do you talk about secularity today?
Yeah, that's right. One of the main through lines in the book is that it is possible to hold an enchanted secularity. This would mean that even if you identify as secular, even if your world is demagicked, so to speak, it's not demystified. And so what that means is that the binary that Weber and others would posit, the binary that puts religion and enchantment on one side, secularity and disenchantment on the other, no longer holds. My hope is that one of the hopes I had when I wrote the book is that just as social scientists have done amazing work to deconstruct and complexify our understandings of secularism, that we might do the same philosophically, and that those kinds of analyses would go hand in hand. And so, I can go into the details of why I think it's possible to hold an enchanted secularity. I get that term from Jeff Koski's book, Arts of Wonder. But basically since Weber, since the 100 years since Weber's address, everything from quantum physics to advances in complex systems and biology. I mean, there's so many examples have shown us that features like uncertainty and unpredictability are part of the world. And so even if you identify as a secular person, the kinds of mystery that Weber would put on the religious side are part of your worldview. And that means it is possible to hold an enchanted secularity.
Right. You talk about it in a really interesting way, and perhaps for those that are a little bit more familiar with philosophy of religion and some of these dialogues, it will be self-evident, but I don't know that that's everyone who's listening to the podcast today. So part of that really has to do with the kind of subject, the kind of person that we are in the world, the liberal subject that Weber is talking about, and the way in which that subject is limited by rationality, right? When you add rationality, you lose the mystical stuff that makes life worth living, and that there are real consequences from your perspective to that move. Do I have that right? Is that on track?
One of the things that I wanted to try to demonstrate was that Weber's analysis and much of the secularization thesis rests on the idea, right, which is now an outdated philosophical idea, that human beings are discrete rational subjects. When one starts in a humanities program in grad school, in the first year they're going to read Foucault, they're going to read other thinkers and analysts who are going to show them that this idea that we are discrete rational subjects is just a fantasy. Well, if that's a fantasy, then what are some of the next steps that we can extrapolate? One of them is that much philosophical work over the last half century has shown us that the rational subject was meant to be an inversion of the all-knowing God, right? That the rational subject was meant to replace the divine and take the sort of throne as the all-knowing, all-encompassing, powerful creature. Well, inversion is not subversion. And so when you invert the sort of theistic framework and you replace the all-knowing God with the all-knowing rational subject, you don't disrupt the system, right? You don't disrupt or subvert the framework that put that God in place to begin with. What I try to do in the book is say, when you sort of recognize that the rationalism of Weber and others is outdated, you recognize very quickly that what's also outdated is their understanding of the binary between the secular and the religious. And so just as we need to rethink the rational subject, we need to rethink that border between what we think of as the secular and the religious.
Right. And so in the long history of 125 years of people really kind of engaging with these concepts, you described that there's a divide between two things, and I want to get the language exactly right here: continental philosophical theology and continental philosophy of religion. What's the difference between these two, or say Charles Taylor and John Caputo?
One of the audiences I'm addressing in the book are a large swath of folks in the academic study of religion who believe that philosophy of religion is nothing but a code word for like crypto theology, right? So if you meet a philosopher of religion at a conference or at the AAR, that's a code word for somebody who's really doing theology, but they're trying to hang out in a department of religious studies or in this academic study of religion. A lot of folks find that philosophy seems kind of useless for religious studies in the 21st century. One of my counters to that is that there is a difference between philosophical theology and philosophy of religion. And sometimes the lines get blurred and sometimes the lines get sort of a little bit messy, but it's at least worth it to kind of outline from the beginning the different positionality of the two. And so for my money, philosophical theology is trying to affirm or defend or legitimate, right, a religious tradition, in this case, a Christian tradition of some kind. For me, as a philosopher of religion who works in religious studies, philosophy of religion is about thinking with or philosophizing with rather than for or against religions. And what I mean by that is I take very seriously the idea that religions are not only for me a site of analysis, but they are a philosophical resource. That when I engage in encounters with religious texts and communities and actors, that they enable me to expand my understanding, to expand my normative assumptions regarding selfhood, the world, and so on.
Right. So you call this and to philosophize with religion rather than against it or for it. I really like that formulation because it gives me the sense that philosophy has a clear utility, that it's a tool, right? That it has, and as a hammer sees a nail, right? Like the tool of philosophy on religion can do certain kinds of things for us. So what do you think are some of the benefits of philosophizing with religion for folks that are in religious studies that may not be philosophers of religion?
Yeah. For me, the main benefit comes in the classroom. One of the things I've said to colleagues over the last few months here is that if philosophy of religion is dead, if it's no longer viable in the academic study of religion, then somebody forgot to tell my students. Because every time I offer a class on race and religion or death and dying, every time I offer a class on the meaning of life, we practice the virtues of patience and empathy. We try our best to enter into the worlds and the texts and the practices and the rituals of the people we're studying. However, when we do that, my students want to ask further questions. They want to think with religions and ask what those encounters that we've just staged mean for them. How can studying the burial rites of the Tanah Torajans in Sulawesi, Indonesia, help them reflect on sort of problems in our healthcare system, right? And so that kind of move from encounter to reevaluation of normative assumptions about the world, to me, is a feature of religious studies. I mean, I know that many folks are going to say, look, there's no reason to bring in Derrida or Levinas into many undergraduate classes. And I wholeheartedly agree. But I also know that those same folks will agree with me that people like Robert Orsi and Saba Mahmood have done this very kind of work, that they have reflected on what their encounters with religious subjects have meant for their own understandings of themselves and the world. And so for me, that is a clear and direct benefit, that when we introduce people to the study of religion, we're giving them the tools to reflect critically on who they are in the world. I tell people all the time, my goal is rarely to clone myself. If I have 20 students in a class, I don't want to make 20 more religion scholars. I want to sort of leave that class hoping that I've contributed to future scientists, CEOs, teachers, volunteers, city council members, mayors, nurses, having the sort of intellectual capacity to approach the most important aspects of life in ways that they couldn't before, in ways that honor the absolute nuance and difficulty of the human condition. And so for me, that's it. Even when I'm not teaching, a philosophical text per se, I always feel like I'm bringing that perspective into my class.
I appreciate the kind of nod to especially Orsi here. Was one of the people that I was thinking about that was really kind of like working through what it means to be in a religious tradition and then try to kind of narrate the particularity of that experience, and then to really dwell on what that particularity can say to someone that doesn't share that orientation. That do you think of that as translation, as a kind of dislocating of people that allows them to kind of lose those normativities, as you were suggesting? For you, how do you think about that kind of pedagogical move that you're doing?
One of the ways that I explain how this works is that sometimes, in order to teach geometrical scale, elementary school teachers will teach artistic perspective, right? That if a student can understand perspective in art, that they might have a better chance at understanding geometrical scale. Now, does that mean that math is converted to art in that scenario? Does that mean that art is converted to math? It doesn't mean either of those things. It means that there's an analogous logic between the two. There's a touch point that helps someone gain a vision or perspective that they were having trouble or maybe could not have taken on before. And that's kind of how I understand the dislocation you speak of. I understand it as providing us an expansion of our vision in a way that's really critical. To me, that's the greatest contribution that religious studies has for our students, and that's something that I think philosophy of religion can bring to the table.
You also say at the very, very end of your book, which has dealt with Heidegger and George Bataille and Jean-Luc Marion and Thomas Carlson and thinkers for whom it can be a real challenge to kind of make it through these serious philosophy of religion texts. So I'm very I'm very relieved, for instance, that, we're not walking into every undergraduate classroom and slapping down, a translation of Being in Time and being like, all right, here's our work. Although to be honest with our audience, that's exactly what you and I did in graduate school together.
It is.
But you present a very particular kind of problem at the end of the book. And that problem is that apart from maybe Saba Mahmood and Bob Orsi and a handful of others, there is a persistence of this dialogue in exclusion to Christianity, right? That people that are philosophers of religion are so tied to the Christian orientation of philosophy of religion. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on whether there's maybe any interreligious philosophy of religion that's really kind of emerging. You call for greater diversity and greater perspectives from who we're talking to and from what positions we're speaking from. And I wonder for those of us that are welcoming of that kind of comparative and interreligious dialogue, how that kind might fit into your ideas about secularity.
Yeah, this is a persistent problem in the academy. It's a particular problem in philosophy. I think what you're seeing in philosophy departments around the country are people reckoning with the homogeneity of their resources, their texts, their canon, and their personnel. One of the things we need to do, just to put it simply, is we need to decolonize philosophy, and we need to decolonize philosophy of religion. I just edited a volume for the Journal of Cultural and Religious Theory, and there's a great essay there, if anyone wants to check it out, by Patrice Haynes, who works at Liverpool Hope University in the UK. And she does a great job of not only describing how we might go about decolonizing philosophy of religion, but then puts that into practice in actual field work that she's done. And so we need to continue that. And I would go so far to say that the kind of future of philosophy of religion, and maybe the future of philosophy, I'm not sure, depends on that project. That if that can't happen, that we are going to see a kind of passing by of this subdiscipline as the rest of the academy progresses.
Do you think that there's a sense that the kind of impenetrability of the kind of, I don't want to call it a house of cards, but of the layering of all of these dialogues, right? That if you're going to read Heidegger, you have to read Kant. And if you're going to read, if you're going to read Heidegger, then you need to read, Levinas, right? And if you're going to read, Bataille, then you have that every person you read is in this larger narrative, but those narratives are so challenging at this point that part of a decolonial deconstruction is the freedom to say, yeah, I know that for a long time, the canon was based on these white dudes, and now it should not be, and it's okay to maybe not talk about them at every moment that they could arise, because perhaps that's all the moments right now in philosophy of religion. Is that available as well as a move to those that are thinking about this?
I think it needs to be, and I think this is why in response to one of your previous questions, I went right to teaching. Is what teaching has shown me is that what we have to offer as scholars of religion, but what I have to offer as philosopher of religion is not necessarily recounting the layers and layers of the history of philosophy as you just sort of referenced them. That is not what is compelling to my students. What is compelling to my students is not only investigating religions, but then asking what our investigations might mean for our conceptions of love and death and sex and mortality and birth and community and all those things. And so that's what I mean when I say we need to do a better job of philosophizing with religions rather than philosophizing about religions. If philosophers of religion want to say to the rest of their colleagues in the Academy of, the American Academy of Religion, that our function is really to, sort of examine all the religious data we can and come up with the best comparative definition of religion possible, I think most people are going to say, in fact, we're good. We don't really need that. We're not concerned with that. And you guys can go maybe do that on your own or just not do it at all. But if we make a different case, if we say that this is not about tracing layers of philosophical narratives, nor is it about sort of pretending that we are the truth evaluators who will, help all scholars of religion understand the category of religion. If we say, no, we're the ones who are going to, like everyone else here, in some way investigate religions critically, whether that's a sacred text, whether that's a community, whether that is a history. And then, though, we're going to add a second step, right? We're going to sort of make that step that Orsi and Mahmoud, as well as the others that I mentioned in my book, make, which is to say we're going to reflect on what this means for our normative assumptions. If we make that move, I think we can have a greater level of accessibility, not only for more scholars who are interested in this kind of work, but especially for our students, especially for the 19-year-old who's walking into the class, hoping to find something compelling when they take their maybe first and only religious studies course.
Right. I really like the way that you put it in this one section of your book. I pulled the quote because I thought it was really good. You thought it was good too. You italicized it. These are the secularist assumptions often applied to philosophy of religion, that if one learns from religion, then one's thought is illegitimate in the modern university. Right? That there's this sense that we can't learn from the traditions that we study, right? That somehow that's forbidden. Now we can critically appraise them. We can try to explain why they do something. But then if it provides something to us, right, as a person who's in that classroom, as a student in the university, that somehow we have delegitimized the religious studies work that we're doing.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. This is a tricky process. We have to engage in the most rigorous scholarship we can. However we are investigating religions, we have to do that with rigor, historically, sociologically, critical textual studies, whatever it may be. That goes without saying. However, I don't think that precludes what you just said, which is learning from and reflecting upon our own normative assumptions as a result of that study. I don't think those two are mutually exclusive. And I think what it does for me is it means that philosophy of religion is always bicameral. Like it always has there's always a two-step process, and it's always bifocal, right? That we have to have the rigor to be scholars of religion who investigate religions, but we also have to have the philosophical capaciousness to draw back from those encounters and reflect upon our own positionality in the world and the kind of guiding beliefs we have about it.
If I can, there's one takeaway phrase that I'd really like to offer to our listeners here, and that's non-secularist secularities. You spend a lot of time in your work talking about the ways in which religion projects secularity, almost as much as we can imagine that there is some secular person out there who identifies as secular, who is then creating the secular, right? That's not how the process works. Can you give us a kind of glimpse of how a non-secularist secularity, how that works, and what that is like as a tool that we can then take to our own areas?
So if we go back to the Weber that you mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, the binary there is that the religious person lives in a mystical or mystified world, and that they are therefore enchanted, right? The secular person supposedly lives in a demystified world, in a disenchanted world. What this does is it sets up two opposite or two sides of a binary where the goal is to vanquish the other. And so the assumption is that if you are a secular person, then you must be a secularist, that your goal is to delegitimize religion in all forms. I've said this many times. There are atheist fundamentalists just as there are religious fundamentalists. Many of your listeners will not be surprised to hear that the new atheists are fundamentalists along the lines as many of the evangelicals I talk about on my podcast. A non-secularist secularity recognizes that even for the secular person, even for the person who identifies as non-religious and professes no belief or adherence to supernatural deities or forces or whatever it may be, that their world is marked by uncertainty. It is marked by unpredictability. It is marked by unknowability, by the very fabric of the world itself. And if that's true, then what I'm offering in my model is not a way to convert religion to the secular worldview or vice versa. I'm not trying to make some sort of easy collapse of these things. But what I do want to say is, if there's a sort of apophaticism, if there's an unknowing dimension to both the secular and the religious person's worldview, then maybe there are points of resonance, maybe there are points of comparison, maybe there are points of dialogue that have been overlooked and sort of hidden because we've, whether explicitly or implicitly, continued to adhere to the religious secular binary that goes back to Weber and sort of continues into many iterations of the secularization thesis.
Right. So in that sense, by really looking carefully at the construction of the secular, it brings you back to it in a way that's free of being exclusive of religious stuff, right? There are religious persons who have to engage, right, with the secular world. They can't avoid the public square. They can't avoid, voting, right? And that those people have orientations in the world that are not captured. Right. When we create two boxes and you say you can only be in this one or you can only be in that one, and there's nobody in the middle and there's no crossing from one to the other, right? And that there's very little dialogue between them.
And it also changes my position as a scholar, because when I go into my investigations of religions, instead of assuming that I am, again, that rational subject who's going there to shed illuminate the dark spaces of the mysterious, hidden corners of religion, right? Instead of thinking of myself as the rational knower who will sort of explain to the world how everything works, I'm going to do my best to critically engage religions analytically and critically. I want to produce scholarship that somehow advances a conversation regarding whatever it is I'm studying. But my position as a scholar is then to say, oh, maybe the points of unknowability or uncertainty, maybe the points of faith that I found in those traditions are somehow resonant with my own worldview, even if I sort of consider myself to be a secular person. One of the things I say sometimes to my class is that it's possible to be a secular person of faith. And if you think about it that way, it might change your perspective on what you're doing, not only as a citizen of the world, but also as a scholar of religion.
Well, I'm so thankful for your time today. It's been really interesting to talk to you about this work. It's a challenging work, but I have to say that I really enjoyed it. And I hope that some of our readers or our listeners will read it and enjoy it as well. You also have a podcast. I want to make sure that there's a chance that you can advise everybody to visit. Remind us again about the name of the podcast and where folks can find that.
So I am co-host of Straight White American Jesus, and you can find Straight White American Jesus on Stitcher, on Apple Podcasts, on Google, on most places people get their podcasts. And you can find me on Twitter at Bradley Onishi. And we do have a Facebook page for the podcast that's called Straight White American Jesus, and it's pretty easy to find.
Well, I'm so thankful for your time today. Have a great day.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
I had a really great time talking with Brad. Brad and I went to graduate school together, and now he's at Skidmore. And what's really funny is that the work that he's doing on philosophy of religion, I started when he was in the program with me, and we both took a class together from Thomas Carlson, who features prominently in the book that Brad and I were kind of talking about. And beyond that book, we were in Tom Carlson's class on Heidegger, trying to kind of understand these things together. And in the interview, we talk about how it's really hard, even as a graduate school student, even when you have nothing else but to devote yourself entirely to Heidegger and to try to understand what he had to say about the philosophy of religion and what impact maybe his works had on religious studies. It's so hard. So not impenetrably hard, but close to impenetrable. Bree, do you have the experience that a lot of people do, that some of this high continental theory that we could do Bataille and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and some of these big names, that they're just too hard to kind of work with for undergraduates or people in the general public? What should we do when we have, maybe a landmark philosophical text and it's exceedingly challenging for readers?
Well, I remember my first encounter with Merleau-Ponty. It was actually in the third year of my undergrad, which is the final year of our degree in Australia. And I remember just sitting there and thinking, God, I am thick. It was just so dense and so amazing, but I really struggled with it. And I remember the way that we were sort of taught to engage with it was actually try and put it into practice, try and use a methodology that you can find in Merleau-Ponty's work and see if you can actually put it into practice. And I personally found that really useful, of instead of just sort of reading it and trying to just fully comprehend it, if you try and put it into practice, try and sort of see how it works in some sort of study, then it actually will sort of come to life and it will have more of a sense of what it's trying to achieve. And I personally found that quite useful, not to say that would work for everybody. But I would really like to hear from our listeners about how they help undergrads and help even graduate students, tackle the philosophy of religion. What pedagogies do you use? How do you engage with it in your classes? Dave, do you have any sort of tips that you have to help students engage with this sort of material?
Shorter passages and close reading. Like it's all for me, it's all about, can we try to really understand what the particular author was writing? We'll use maybe an instrumental concept, if there's a really good one, to kind of to latch onto, and then read as short a section as you can possibly get, where it is available to them, and then you go through the language and you talk about maybe some of the background if there's secondary readings, but even that it can be a huge ask, right? Even a page or two of some of these really important philosophy of religion writers can be exceedingly challenging. So I too, like you, would love to hear what the audience has in their back pockets for when they need to tackle these big ideas. And if you enjoyed today's podcast, I know that you're thinking about these things, because one of Brad's big suggestions in his book and in his work is that we think with these philosophy of religion rather than kind of using them for or against religion, and try to kind of really think through them in practice, as you said. And that's absolutely the case here.
Well, what do we have coming up next week?
Next week, we have a really interesting roundtable that was recorded at the BASR. This is in the fall, and that's how long sometimes it takes us to get everything around. But Chris Cotter spoke with Vivian Asmos and Tim Hutchings and Suzanne Owing, a power trio, and they all spoke about media and the study of religion, and about mediation, and about the news, and about how we use media in our teaching. And this has been a very consistent theme in the podcast and in the responses that we have for a long time. It's been something that Eileen Barker and David Gordon Wilson and Timu Tyra and Paul Hope Chung and Bridget Myers, so many people have been on the podcast to talk about this, and we're delighted to be able to continue those conversations. And so I guess until then, the only thing that's left to say is Thanks for listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by editors Brianne Fallon and David McConeghy, and founding editors Chris Cotter, that's me, and David Robertson, that's him. Our features are edited by Rebecca Barrett-Fox, with marketing managed by Benjamin Marcus. Our Opportunities Digest managed by Ella Bach, podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, and social media managed by Ray Radford.
Don't forget, you can support the project by using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals. Thanks for listening.